Thank you, Denise. Thank you to all the people who made it possible for me to be here. And thank you very much for all of you, for attending. I'm really happy to present this paper because it's new work for me, and it takes me a little away from studying institutions and organizations into the direction of studying biography. And this is the first outing of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, so I really would value any comments that shift the direction as well of the project. And this is a biography. I'm really interested in what biography can tell us as scholars of politics, because I think some other grand narratives have fallen apart a little bit in terms of their explanatory power. And this moment really seeing some value in biography. Jane Kamensky, the head of the Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute, talks about biography as a way of telling history inside out. And I find that a very appealing metaphor. To think about this history of South African politics, which is so large and so emblematic for so many people of stories of transition from authoritarianism into democracy, struggles that have led to victory, struggles that have failed us, all these grand narratives about which I feel I have little more to add at this point. And so I'm enjoying going back into thinking about that history from the inside out. So what would a biography add to our understanding of politics? The first thing that strikes me about biography is the way in which it unsettles and sometimes even completely disrupts existing narratives, particularly of nationalism. And the South African story of democracy can't be read outside of a nationalist frame. It's such an overwhelming way of thinking about what South African politics was about. But particular stories of people like Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, I'm going to refer to her as Winnie Mandela, for ease of my tongue, tripping off my tongue, disrupts the simpler narrative of nationalism in which she is embedded as a central figure in the South African story of nationalism. You will know this because many people have heard of her mainly as the wife of Nelson Mandela. And for an American audience, I think you will particularly remember the role that the Nelson and Winnie trope played in building a global solidarity movement, and of embodying that in a very romantic and very powerful imagery. So the first point I want to make about the way in which thinking about the biography of Winnie helps us is that I think it shows us how much of that nationalist narrative, with these two people at the center of it, was a constructed and a purposive trope that did an injustice to the variety of struggles that were happening inside the country. And you can see it very clearly in Winnie Mandela's life, that she was not this simple cardboard cutout figure of the mother of the nation, as she was known. So it has this capacity to unsettle, particularly looking at Winnie as opposed to Nelson Mandela, helps us also to unsettle the great men narrative of how change was brought about in South Africa by these male-dominated movements, with women's struggles as auxiliary struggles to the great unfolding process of challenging white domination, and enables us to see race and gender in more complicated terms, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Winnie herself is a much biographied woman. When I was putting the material together for this work, I was able to put together 5 categories of writing and representation about Winnie, which is remarkable. And I'm not going to go into that methodology, the archive question here, but just to know that she herself is much biographied, and she is also has autobiographized herself in very interesting ways. So there is not a stable, singular narrative of Winnie Mandela. She herself has presented herself in different terms to the world at different moments, as I think we all do. We tell the story of our lives in different parts of our lives and to different kinds of people in different ways. So I'm not by any manner or means saying there is one good way to write her biography, nor did she understand herself ever to be doing one clear particular thing or her life having a clear trajectory. But the biographies that have been written about her are mostly about Winnie as the wife of Nelson Mandela, and they are, I would just put them into 2 camps. There's Mary Benson's biography of her, which was written in 1983, and her own autobiography, which was not quite an autobiography, called Part of My Soul Went With Him, which appeared in 1985 and was a kind of political intervention to create the narrative of Nelson and Winnie Mandela, particularly of Nelson Mandela, as the symbolic representative of the struggle of South African people. So it was a purposive narrative, but it's interesting nevertheless. So there are those 2, and then there are all the biographies that come after that, which deal with the almost explicitly try to understand why it is that Winnie Mandela turned to violence as a tactic. So there's all of those I characterize as attempts to theorize the fall, Winnie as the fallen woman. There are multiple biographies of Nelson Mandela in which she is also a figure. She appears also as, in almost all of them, as his Achilles heel, as the person that reveals his, as great as he was not able to control the activities of his wife. As great as he was, there was this terrible tragedy that his wife didn't love him, etc. Right? So there are those elements of the biography. And what I want to do is to argue for a different way of thinking about her. And I want to argue that we should think of her in the way that we might do a biography of any political leader, which is that if we were doing a biography of Winnie Mandela as a political leader, not as a wife and not as the mother of the nation, we would ask, what is the grammar in which political ideas are articulated by this person? What repertoires of communication are used between the political leader and the people that they are claiming to represent? Who do they claim to represent? What does this what successes and constraints were there in the life of this political leader? What kind of vision of society was there? Where did it come from? What shaped that vision? So that's kind of what I want to do by talking about her in a biographical way and in the manner of a political biography. But I also want to do it as a feminist. And that means that I want very much to think about the landscape that created this woman as a landscape that is both public and intimate. That is a landscape of a life in which her own particular experiences shaped the choices she made. Her particular experiences were struggles that she had to engage in a public and political way. So not only to think of her as this figure that is constructed as, or this figure that placed itself within the ANC. Returning to her life from that perspective, what strikes me about Winnie's biography is two things. One is that she is clearly a remarkable person, because nobody becomes, the people who become these large national leaders must have elements of this remarkable capacity early in life, and you certainly see it in Winnie's life, but it's rooted in her life in quite interesting tragedies. The first tragedy is the death of her mother before she's even 9 years old. And it is a tragedy that is, so if we think about the interior landscape of her life, this removal of a very interesting figure, a figure of great authority in her early life, Methodist. Her mother was both her mother and her father were teachers, and her mother was a very strict and religious person with a very punitive view of religion, who believed in the power of prayer as almost a form of self-discipline and removal from the troubles of society, but used that in punitive ways, so that, in her early childhood, Winnie was put into a room and made to pray for hours at a time with her siblings. Her mother died, though, when she was close to 9 years old, and her grandmother and her father became central figures in her life. This was a world in the late 1930s in Pondoland, which is in the eastern part of the Cape. Her family were not from the poorest of the poor by any means, and that's an important part of the story, because they were dispossessed. They were a petty bourgeoisie, if you like, who were dispossessed of their means of wealth, and they were dispossessed within the living memory of her grandmother. So her grandmother had grown up in a context where they had land, and they had cattle, and they had stores, and they had a trajectory that was interrupted by colonial dispossession. And the interpretation of that dispossession was one that was placed upon Winnie at an early age, and she was put into history in a particular way. Successive wars of resistance against the colonial authorities and the invaders were stories of her childhood. They were stories of her family's attempts to halt colonialism, and she had a sense of something being passed on to her as a kind of historic responsibility. Now, this is something that Nelson Mandela's biographers pick up on quite strongly. His chiefly responsibilities. He was an inheritor of the chieftaincy, right? None of the biographies of Winnie Mandela actually point out that in the same way you can see a sense of history and a sense of responsibility being passed down, even though she was a girl. And in fact, her male siblings don't go on to take on this kind of historical mantle, but she does. And she's made very aware of racial dispossession as the central dimension of inequality. That is how she understands it, and I can trace through the rest of her life the way in which race is the language in which she understands that dispossession. This is an important point I want to make, because the dominant historiography of the opposition to apartheid is one that merges race and class very tightly, and in fact in some accounts places class as the dominant explanatory variable. And I myself come from, I think I would still call myself a socialist feminism. So for me, class is absolutely central. But what we have to understand for Winnie is that she comes from a part of the country where this struggle was understood in racialized terms. And even when the ANC shifted its language away from race, increasingly from the 1960s began to talk about the struggle in the terms of multiracialism and in terms of a struggle that would imagine a future society in which white people were considered to be part of any future configuration. For someone like Winnie, that was not a language that was an easy one, right? There was a loss entailed in that language for her through her life. So I can, thinking about it in that way and reading her own writing for the rest of her life is really illuminating for me to see how strongly she holds on to a language of what would later come to be called Black consciousness. She understands it from childhood. She articulates the core struggle as being between black and white. She refers to the enemy in racialized terms. She understands her community of fellow strugglers in racialized terms. This is, I think, later in her life, although she is too old by the time that Steve Biko starts to talk about Black consciousness in the university settings. She's by that stage, in her 40s, late 40s. She's not part, and she never went to university, so she's not part of the intellectual elite. She nevertheless becomes an ally for that movement. And she is an ally for that movement in a way that Nelson Mandela is not, and that many in the ANC elite are not allies for that movement. So in 1976, when the revolt in Soweto happens, she's one of the first people on the scene. She lives in the township, she understands this language, and she becomes the interlocutor for these young people with the ANC, which is in fact quite anxious about what this new language of Black consciousness might do in terms of changing their rhetoric, which is going in a different direction. But she is asked to be, she's the only woman who is asked in 76 to become part of the Black Parents Association, which in Soweto, which is there to support the students, and she is there and she is available. For me, there is a continuity in her political ideas, and it is a continuity that is at odds with the dominant thinking in the ANC. So the fact that she is at the heart of the ANC and at the core of it is not doesn't mean that she is actually ideationally at the core of it. She's a rebel even in that sense. She's using language that goes against the grain of how the ANC is thinking. So associated with that strand that runs through her life, which I'll return to in a moment, associated with that is a particular conception of how race would be undone. Right? How would we undo these hierarchies of race? What would it take? Now, the ANC was moving after 1960, after it had been banned, into armed struggle, but it had a particular conception of armed struggle as, a failed project of armed struggle, one has to say, but it had a notion of an armed struggle that was managed by the ANC, that was tightly controlled, and particular kinds of targets would be identified. Well, Winnie Mandela comes out of a slightly different kind of trajectory. So for her, the only way, the only language in which you can articulate resistance is a violent language. She's not thinking in terms of only the language that can be contained in armed struggle, as in Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is under the political control of the ANC. For her, there's a much more intimate way in which the relationships between black and white people have to be confronted. And she is, and from a very early age, violence is the language she understands. Now, she's exposed to violence in a variety of ways that are some of which are disturbing. So she, at a very young age, as I said, came from a family of great disciplinarians in which corporal punishment was not considered to be problematic, right? This is this was in the 30s. I think most people thought corporal punishment towards children was acceptable, and it certainly was legal and used in the school system. So this is not odd. She herself, as in her many rebellions in her life against teachers, against other kids in school, against her own siblings, as we always are, right, used physical violence to resolve her problems. And it was not questioned, it was part of the way in which she grew up. But what happened when she became politically active is that she became subject to the violence of the state. It's not true that she only became politically active because of Nelson Mandela. I can give you all kinds of reasons for why I say that, but all those biographies that talk about her as this young, naive, beautiful rural girl who comes to the big city and falls in love with Nelson Mandela, and then she becomes politically active as his wife, those do not represent her life accurately. I'm convinced of that. I can find in her records all kinds of ways in which she was beginning to articulate political ideas long before she met Nelson Mandela. That in fact her account of her relationship with Nelson Mandela shows a very acute awareness of the dangers of him defining the narrative. In the 1985 book, which is a book in which the romantic story, the love story of Nelson and Winnie, which is the metaphor through which we are to understand the love story of the nationalist movement for its people, right? The love story at its core of these two people destined to be together but torn apart by an evil state, is not such a romantic love story as she understands it, right? She sees him as somebody who was very distant. Yes, they did, of course they fell in love. He had no romance in the way in which he asked her to marry him. She understood from the very beginning that marrying him was marrying into a movement. She was not surprised when the state locked him up, but she was not surprised because she herself was already politically active and already being locked up herself, already being jailed herself, and because she was at the center of the ANC, experiencing much more violent punishment than other women who were politically active, right? So she is right from the early 1950s, when she is in Johannesburg, joins the ANC Women's League, becomes a public speaker of her own. There's a very interesting interview by one of her comrades that I found, in which she says that from the very first speech that Winnie gave, the women in the room began to compose songs in her honor, right? So she had a charisma of her own, and she clearly wasn't naive. But she engages in political activities and gets locked up, and the state systematically tortures her. Again, not something that's often talked about in relation to the life of Winnie Mandela. So Nelson Mandela got locked up on Robben Island. She was in and out of jail. She was in solitary confinement at one point for 16 months of solitary confinement and psychological torture that led to her having a nervous breakdown. She was beaten. She was subjected to, even when she was not in jail, to torture. The home in which she and her children lived was constantly raided, constantly by the police. They'd barge into the house in the middle of the night. They'd shine bright lights on everything. They'd upturn her wardrobes, her beds, her clothing, looking for who knows what, sometimes for weapons, looking for other people who she may be harboring. When all of that was not enough to put her in her place, they sent her off to a town that she'd never lived in, where she had no friends, called Brandfort. So they put her into a different kind of public solitary confinement known as banishment. Banishment was a term and a political technology for silencing opponents of the state. So her experience of violence was not abstract. It was very real. It was very visceral. It was inflicted on her, and I think it had a dramatic impact on her understanding of politics as at its core violent and not, she was not an intellectual. She wasn't somebody who was at the core of the ANC theorizing what the society should be doing, and she was not theorizing negotiations and strategies for bringing the apartheid state to into a discussion. For her, politics was about life and death. It always was about life and death. And nobody could tell her otherwise because, well, how could you, right? How could you tell someone who's been tortured, whose home is constantly invaded? It was not, these other ideas were not convincing to her. So what gets theorized in the 1980s as the fall of Winnie Mandela, I think, is not so much about the fall of Winnie Mandela, it's the perfect storm in which it becomes apparent to her that the only way to end a violent system is by turning to technologies of violence. And she makes this speech, which became famous across the world. With our match boxes and our necklaces, we will liberate this country. At that moment in which she made this call, and which has become characterized as Winnie going rogue and being a maverick, in fact, there was considerable discussion inside the country about escalating this struggle against apartheid. You may know that by 1985, we were in a state of emergency in the country, and there were two states of emergency between 1985 and 1987 that gave the state extraordinary powers, right? So we all, already there was a state that was considering escalating its already existing violent means of control. And she was not alone in thinking about violence in the sense of a new form of insurgency against the state. And the ANC initially went along with it and issued a call for ungovernability, which it then retracted. But she was not, she did not retract from her stance. And by this stage, by the 1980s, as I was saying to you, Denise, the fact that the ANC only thought of her in terms of being the wife of Nelson Mandela and never considered her in any way as a political leader meant that they never incorporated her into the structures of decision making. So if she did go rogue, I argue, she went rogue because the movement itself had no place for a woman who was seeing herself as a political leader with ideas for what kinds of tactics should be adopted. So there was never a space in which she could articulate those ideas into a committee of the movement. She was not incorporated onto any kind of governing structure of the ANC because they just thought she would always simply be the symbolic figure. She stood in for Nelson Mandela publicly. That was her only role. She herself thought of herself as doing a whole lot more than that. And so it's not so much that she went rogue, it's that she was on the outside of the official structures of the movement, even though she was seen to be acting in its name. That meant, I think we have to acknowledge, it meant that there was no constraint on her either. So when she decided this is what we were doing, regardless of whether it was good or bad, or strategically the right time to do it, or the right tools to do it, there was no way of restraining her. And so we had in 1988 this absolute tragedy, which is the story that many people then later came to associate her with, the killing of Stompie Sape, and the beating of other activists and the murder of the Soweto Dr. Abu Bakr Aswat. If you don't know those details, I can tell you about it. But I think what I want to say about that moment, which then became the subject of a special hearing at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that many people in the townships were using violent tactics at that moment. Many of those tactics were not good tactics. They were not directed at the state. They often were directed at other black people in the township. So they were directed at the local councillors who were seen to be collaborators. They were directed at other activists who people at the Mandela United Football Club decided were traitors or decided were informers. There are no procedures for this. It was the 80s were a time of enormous violence in the townships. And a lot of that violence was directed at other black people. And when we talk about Winnie's complicity in the violence, mostly, I think, it's become a way of putting all of the bad history, all of the bad decisions, all of the excesses of the revolution, if you like, into one story, into centering it on Winnie as the exception. There's the good movement and the good decisions and the drive towards a peaceful transition, and all these other things were aberrations. And you put all those aberrations and excesses into the figure of Winnie Mandela, into the excess of the women in politics, right? And you contain it there, and you make her carry the entire weight of that moment that was so difficult for so many people. So her life from 1990 on becomes all about how to control Winnie, how to demonize her, how to use the Winnie story as a story of how bad violence is as a tactic. Never to look at what other comrades in the movement were doing, never to look at the complicities of the ANC itself in much of this decision making that led to violence. And I'm not suggesting that, I'm certainly not trying to judge it in this way. in talking about it, but simply to say that collapsing it all into the figure of Winnie, and then extricating Nelson Mandela from that story and making him the bearer of all that is virtuous and good, the bearer of all that is humane, all that is about greatness in leadership, the deliverer of freedom, is playing another kind of political trick that is very gendered, that is really very gendered, and plays out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when the good story of the ANC going for a peaceful transition that is negotiated, and now we're in this moment that is which we have to leave behind the past. We have to say that we're going to be sitting around the table as equal citizens, and we're in a non-racial society, and we're in a society which blacks are now in control and will be kind and gentle rulers. That narrative once again is disrupted by the figure of Winnie, because along with the story of the democratic negotiated transition is the story of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we will put all the bad things and we'll speak about it and we'll tie it up in a neat little bow, and then we can move on. And now we no longer have to talk about the violence, which of course continues after 1994, right? I mean, so many things did not change. But the TRC hearing into Winnie Mandela became the place in which to put all of that, all of the violence again. And there's this dramatic moment when Archbishop Tutu appeals to her to just say sorry, just say something went terribly wrong. And then that would be a way in which all the things that went terribly wrong could be put on the table, and then we walk away from it. And she refused. She refused to be that symbol. She refused to be that bearer of the bad, of the excess, of the violence. And so, interestingly enough, I think in that moment she repositioned herself as a symbol of the radical refusal of the terms of the transition. And I think that is what explains her continuing appeal today, because people who are disaffected by the last 23 years, the inability of democracy to deliver all these things that were promised, the ongoing, continuing racial hierarchy in our society, the continued restriction of the life chances of people simply because they are black or black and women. All of that kind of radical knowledge, if you like, is symbolized by her. So her refusal was an interesting moment and keeps her alive as a symbol of a radical alternative that did not materialize. And I think that is why people forgive. They forgive what happened to Stompie Sapé. They forgive what happened to Abu Bakr Asvat. They forgive her for that because they see what is being done in making her bear the responsibility for it. It's a kind of a way of refusing the narrative, the grand narrative of democracy. So she continues to have this purchase as a political figure and a political leader, and it's really interesting to me how many political movements still seek her presence and approval. The newly formed economic freedom fighters, radical young politicians now, went to her first when they were thinking of forming a different political party. Cyril Ramaphosa, before he became the president of the ANC in December, went to see her And after he was elected, one of the first things he did was to go and visit her in her home. There's something about the anointing of Winnie Mandela that continues to matter to people today. So, in those terms, I think her impact on society and on history is going to be very long lasting. She's not a figure that will be easily cast aside, because so much of a larger history is embodied in her individual history, in her own story as a political activist. And I could say a lot more. I could say a lot more about her views on Nelson Mandela, which are really interesting. And, one can hardly believe that she says the things she did, but they are important things to have said. Let me put it that way. But maybe I should kind of stop there, because it's quite a lot to chew on. But what I'm hoping is that those strands of her individual life and violence, the strand of her attempt to be a political leader more than just the wife of, can come together in some explanation that thinks of her in larger terms than simply the fallen women, and if you go back and look at the biographies of Nelson Mandela, and you look at what the biographers say about her, it's fairly shocking to me how gendered that representation is, and how unwilling they are to think about what it must have been like to not have a partner for 27 years, right? And to have this man reappear in your life, and you're suddenly meant to play housey. Right? It was an unfair expectation. But the only way in which they think about it is, oh, isn't it terrible? He suffered for 27 years, and then his wife had affairs, and when he came out of jail, she was horrible to him, and the poor man had to suffer again. There has to be more to that story, and that's kind of what I hope you will see. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So we have 30 minutes for questions.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It's fantastic. And I see some really interesting sort of interventions that you're making here. I'll just highlight a couple of them that I think will be really useful. The legacies of violence that sort of shape her politics. That's something that I haven't heard spoken about before. And the episode of the Nelson Mandela Football Club and the speech about the necklace sort of comes out of nowhere. And you will have to explain necklacing to Americans.
Thanks, yes.
So I think that's really great. And you weren't actually explicit in your talk about how deeply patriarchal the ANC is. Of course, that's informing everything that you're saying, but I think it's worth making that explicit. And, part of the outrage within the ANC and the UDF, I was in South Africa at the time, when she just wouldn't be what she was supposed to be. The symbol, right, the nice female symbol, the consort to Nelson Mandela, stand there, support your man, hold his hand when he walks out of prison, that's your job. You've got no other job. There was an outrage that she thought she had other jobs.
Yeah.
And it was coming especially from the men, right?
Yeah.
And that from the time that she first emerges in the 50s as a partner to Nelson Mandela, all the way through her career, there's as you know, patriarchy is really shaping reactions to it. And we see today, women who are highly placed in the ANC usually have some sort of dynastic connection to powerful men. There's so much, but I'm going to stop right there and just ask you to be explicit for a second about the ANC and what a deeply patriarchal organization it is. And I know you've written about the ANC Women's League, so I'd like to just hear you riff on that.
Thanks, yeah. Well, I think it's like all nationalist movements on the continent. The ANC is founded on this extremely patriarchal construct of the family and the nation as the family writ large. So it's right in its DNA is this idea that the movement is a public version of the family. You have the male National Executive Committee, and then you have a women's league, and you have a youth league, and each of those structures in the ANC is understood to have specific roles. The NEC, the male heartland, is where all the decisions get made. It was until 1943, women were not even allowed to be members of the ANC. They only got membership in 1943. ANC had been formed in 1917, and they got it after a fight. And then when they got membership, it didn't mean that they would get into the NEC. They were expected to have, the Women's League's role was to be the cultural, the way in which the culture and the values of the ANC would be transmitted to the youth. The women's role was to make tea and provide the catering for political meetings, and when they were in exile, it was to provide the home for all the exiled members of the ANC. It was to be the social workers of the movement. The youth, equally within this patriarchal system, were seen to be the future leaders. They were understood to be male, by the way. Youth is equivalent until very recently in South Africa with men, young men, right? And so that part of patriarchy, which is really about between men, older and younger men, right? The youth, the movement always understood the youth league as the place in which the radical ideas will come, and these young hotheads have to be controlled by the wise heads of the NEC. So all are locked in this notion of politics as the public manifestation of a hierarchy of relations in the family. But it goes even beyond that kind of patriarchy, which is, what was the vision of society? Women had to argue all through the 1950s for unpaid labor to be considered, childcare to be thought about in political terms, for matters such as bride wealth, lobola, to be considered part of what we need to think about in politics. The women constructed their own separate charter, which is far more radical than the Freedom Charter, because it understands that the economy is also gendered, and the economy rests on the unequal expropriation of certain kinds of labor, of women's labor, that was considered to be more exploitable than male labor, even black male labor, right? And so already from the 50s, women were articulating, I think, a much more radical vision of a future society and transformed economy way beyond what the ANC itself was thinking about, in which it understood mostly that it would be about returning the country to black rule, black majority rule. From the beginning, the women in the ANC were thinking about a transformed society that would have radical equality, a radical conception of equality. In South Africa, that idea was carried much more by the South African Communist Party and by the workers' movement. But even in the unions had to be pushed screaming and shouting into thinking about where women fitted into the working class, right? And about sexual harassment in the workplace, about the fact that men The women did a double shift, right? They went to work in the factories and they went home in the evenings and they had to look after the family. So all of those issues could not be contained in the ANC's nationalist vision for where it was going, and in fact never understood that women might have interests of their own, or that women might get up on platforms and speak in ways that are different to the register in which it wanted them to speak about politics. So it wanted women to be the ones who appealed to peace and to caring and so on. And you know, look at Winnie. She wasn't only about that. You know, why should she be constrained only by talking about peace when she could see a world that was so violently constructed that the fundamentals had to be spoken about. So ANC is, and it still remains, a very patriarchal organization, and I think the Women's League itself has been part of upholding that patriarchy, and that the radical break in South Africa has come now after 1994, where you have young black feminist queer women beginning to put a whole lot of new questions that are highly threatening to the power elite on the table, and they're beginning to do it in quite interesting ways. And again, I think what might end up being written out of the record is the importance of those women in keeping alive the rape by Jacob Zuma of a young woman. It was that group that kept that question alive and disrupted all attempts to normalize Jacob Zuma's presidency, you know, and I think it did work, even though the rest of the country only caught up with it when it was convenient to talk about his corruption. You know, the feminists never supported Zuma as the president. So yeah, patriarchy continues to be a major issue, and I think that politics still thinks about the essential battle of ideas as being between the older men and the younger men, unfortunately. Yeah, Via.
Thank you. First of all, this is extraordinarily rich, and I love the idea of introducing or reinforcing the questions about grammars and genre within the study of politics, really pushing the idea of what a biography that's not a great man biography can do. I wanted to hear a little bit more about this idea of Black consciousness, because what we heard, I think, in the talk is about the ways in which it's rooted for her in experience of dispossession, and it helps to account for her opposition to or her challenge to the idea of multiracialism in the movement, and she has a sense of struggle being inherently violent. But I'm curious about whether or not within her work, whether even if she, whether either in her practice or in her speeches and elsewhere, we get an account of what a kind of positive politics of Black consciousness would look like. I mean, is it predicated on something we might call sovereignty or self-determination? And are there any of these features that you're finding among the ANC women in Mandela's work as well? So is there, are there elements of a kind of feminist consciousness in there? And if not, what does that tell us?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I can't fully answer it right now, because her politics was practice, not theorizing. And so I can look to her practice to some extent, and what you can see in her practice is that she was not anti-white entirely. I mean, she wasn't. She worked with white people and white women, and was very close to them, and saw them as comrades and allies. And so she had a very sophisticated notion in that sense that it wasn't about individual white people, but about a system of power, right? And so to say that the white man, she always said, the white man understands nothing unless we say it through the barrel of a gun, was not for her simply about deploying violence against any white person. It was systemic. I don't think she thought beyond that. In fact, I think in her own practice around the Mandela United Football Club, and that moment in which she says the necklace was a petrol-doused tire that was set alight, put over a person's head and set alight. Right? It's really very violent. The moment that she was doing that, she was, I think, seizing sovereignty. She was seizing sovereignty, but with no awareness of what the consequences of that were. And the Mandela United Football Club actually undermined all forms of not only the sovereignty of the state, which was easily, right, that was not such a difficult argument to make, but the structures of decision making within Soweto particularly, the community structures were displaced by the Mandela United Football Club. They were a law only unto themselves and unto Winnie. And that was a problem. And I don't think she had a way of making sense of it, because she had no access to the arenas of conversation in which that was being debated. She was not considered to be a leader who was brought into that conversation. So she, and in Soweto, what would happen is you'd have young activists with all kinds of ideas for how the revolution should be conducted, but you also had political schools, if one could call it that. You had spaces in which people debated things and argued over it and showed why we can't just go and attack a white person because they're white. There was serious conversation and discussion. She wasn't part of any of those. And the Mandela United Football Club wasn't part of it. And so it is problematic. The uses of violence in that moment are problematic to me, looking at it analytically. I don't think it was an automatic strategy. I think there were many conversations happening in many townships where people were saying, but we don't want that. We don't want necklacing. This is wrong. It was well understood. But she was not part of those communities of conversation. And that's part of the tragedy of her life. The state kept her out of it. The patriarchal organizations didn't make ways for her to be part of it. And all they could think about was how to control her, rather than any, the structural question of how you would get really radical actors into a conversation. So, at the end of the day, I don't, many violent activists are made heroes and martyrs, but not her. But thank you, because I will think much more clearly when I look at her writing and her speeches again, how she may think of it.
Practice,
Yeah.
That's the resource that you have.
But her practice, which was a kind of populist way of relating to people, very intimate relationships. She was amazing. She would visit people every time someone was locked in jail in Soweto. Winnie would be there with the family. If someone died, she was at the funeral. She would break her banning orders. She had this sort of intimate populist relationship with with people. But she also considered herself to be above the people at the same time, which is not so unusual. You know, Perón, I'm thinking of Evita Perón as that kind of a leader, right? It's just that was not the only model of leadership in black communities. You know, and in the paper I tried to spell that out in more detail. It's not inevitable that happened. So we can't say that the violence that happened was you know, I wouldn't want to completely legitimize it, because I think there were many people who chose other ways, and in fact the necklacing stopped, and that's important to note. And it didn't stop because of an elite out there saying it must stop. It stopped because people on the ground did not want this kind of tactic. I will ask you. Yeah?
That was fascinating, thank you. You mentioned great man theories of history, and I was wondering if there's a danger of reinscribing great woman theories of history, or if there's something inherent to women's biography or feminist biography that resists or even makes incomprehensible or contradictory the figure of the great woman.
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, because it's true that in response to the great man, we now have, you know, so now Hillary Clinton writes her memoir, and then they're going to be, probably in the next year, you know, 10 biographies of Hillary Clinton, the greatest president that never was. I'm putting this in inverted commas, but yeah, there is, of course, because politics, and particularly our professions in the academia, continue to use these grandiose notions, right, and to think about. Yeah, there's something to that. There aren't that many women who are in such positions of power as to worry me yet, that it will end up in that direction. Do you know what I mean? It's yeah. Of course, that's always a danger, but there's always a danger in writing a political biography that you fall in love with the subject and see only the subjects. You become so sympathetic. You have to be sympathetic to the subject, I think, to write a biography. It's not fair otherwise, in some way. It's not ethical, right? But so there is. I mean, I found my own position changing the more I wrote about her, the more I delved into her life, the more the torture, the state's torture of her shocked me, even though I had read other accounts of torture and I knew other things, and I thought, my goodness, you know, this woman is utterly remarkable to still be standing after 16 months in solitary confinement and a nervous breakdown. And she got up and she got out of jail and she went right back into the struggle, and, you know, so great. Are we replacing them with great women theories? I don't like the idea that they're single actors who are that decisive. On all my other work has been about collectivities and the importance of collectivities. But I do think that leadership matters. I wouldn't deny that. And I have always been very critical of the personalization of the anti-apartheid movement into the figure of Nelson Mandela. I mean, I think that is overblown and unjustified by the historical record. And of course, he was a remarkable human being, but, you know, Mandela did not deliver freedom. That sentence can be said in many ways. It was not only Mandela who delivered freedom, but also what we got out of it was not freedom. So you know what I mean. So I think that it's much more complex than that. But I do think that lives enable us to see politics in interesting ways, and that we don't see when we only study organizations. Yeah.
So I think what you're doing with biography is just fabulous here, and I love how you're connecting the intimate, the political, and the symbolic in ways that I think do cut against a great woman cookie cutter. By the way, it's really interesting. But what work is this framing of landscape doing for you?
Oh,
I find it
right.
very evocative, but can you say more about how that, as a rubric, is helping you connect these different levels?
So, yes, great question. And so it comes from my reading of Carolyn Steedman. I don't know if any of you know her work, a feminist historian. And she has a book, Landscape for a Good Woman, in which for her, landscape is the world of work. In Lancashire, it's a book about her mother, and it's about the mills and work, and the way in which an individual is not, in which all lives are shaped by the political economy in which a social life is lived. And so it's a play on that notion of landscape. But what I take from Carolyn Steedman is this idea that lives are lived against backdrops of economy and politics, but there is also an interior landscape of family that Steedman talks about. So that public landscape and intimate landscape is what I'm hoping to. I think somebody like Winnie Mandela has to be framed in terms of both of those, and in both of those landscapes, they are larger than life landscapes because of the timing, not just the person, but it is a life lived at a particular moment in South African history that makes it grandiose. Yeah, Carolyn Steedman's book is about a working class woman. It's somewhat different, but I'm playing with that. She says landscape for a good woman, and I say landscape for a rebel woman, because I'm not sure. I don't know if I want to talk about good and bad women, and yeah. But it's a nice metaphor that I haven't. I want to use more and more, and I love the work of Steedman. If none of you have read her work, you should. And she's a very spare biographer, so you have to read a lot into it. I'm more of a historian in some ways than she is. Robert.
Yeah, I have a question about violence, because you seem to represent Winnie Mandela as the violent one, as the ANC kind of peaceful.
Okay. No.
But because what's the,
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to know why people in South Africa differentiate the violence of the ANC from that associated with Winnie, not only internally during the guerrilla movement, but also in the camps, which were terribly violent.
That's right.
And where people from the ANC killed other people from the ANC. So why?
So I don't want to make that. I don't.
Okay.
I don't. In fact, what I want to do is to show how she became exceptionalized, and by exceptionalizing her, it was a way of exonerating everything else, right? No, I think you're right. I don't think of her as particularly violent, I think there was a complex discussion about the use of violence going on, some of which was under the control of the ANC, but some of it was not. The ANC was out of the country. People were forging strategies on their own. The ANC did not have the degree of hegemony that it often claims it did in the 1980s. But I think it's part of its self-narrativization that it only used violence under exceptional conditions. It did not, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, want to discuss its own uses of violence. And so it's really striking to me that the only place in which the violence of black people is dealt with at all in the TRC is in the Winnie Mandela hearing. The camps are excluded from the discussion. And it makes it seem as if that violence was aberrant, or that what she did was aberrant, And it was not. That, I think, is the point I'm trying to make here. But I think that there's a way in which putting it all into the figure of Winnie is a way in which it can say, well, you know, and then what does Nelson Mandela represent? He represents the good and the peaceful path. And you can sort of write out of the story that he was there at the founding of the guerrilla movement. You kind of start to, you know, so you have the sanitized history in which all these uncomfortable bits get written out. And I think that is part of what nationalist organizations try to do. They create this image of themselves as good and virtuous.
Transformation of the ANC from a quote-unquote revolutionary movement to a movement acceptable to respectable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a way of also legitimizing democracy in a particular way, you know, that it would now be carrying liberal democracy forward. And in order to do that, it had to leave certain parts of its own story behind. And this was a way of doing that. We leave it behind. Now we go into the future. We no longer need to be violent people. We must go and vote. Maybe that is the appropriate political tactic. And all these other, but the system remained violent. And the police remain incredibly violent. You know, it's under the ANC that the police killed 34 striking miners. So institutional violence continues in very directed ways. Well, thank you.
Any more questions?
Can I ask one more? This is such a great conversation. I was really interested in what you were saying about Winnie's early political involvement and the speech that she gave before a women's group where the women were singing praise songs to her afterwards. It was so striking during the Thabo Mbeki presidency what a natural politician she was. This Thabo was not. Thabo would go into the townships and he would look so uncomfortable and so unhappy. And Winnie, she may have been a queen, but she was a queen among her people.
Yeah.
She was out there, right? I mean, she was just so perfect. Such a great natural politician. And so could you say just a little bit more about her earliest emergence into politics, into political activism?
I'll give you one little anecdote. So she became involved in a range of issues, a range of struggles against the extension of passes to women. Right? The state was trying to pass legislation that would require African women to have a piece of paper allowing them to be in the city. And she got involved in opposition to these, and she has to talk to people about this, about why passes are bad. She has, she's with all these women leaders, and they're going to go out and they're going to encourage women to get involved in the campaign against passes. And she is pulled aside by Helen Joseph and Hilda Bernstein, and a whole lot of women said, right, now you need to have some lessons in public speaking. And she said, well, I did go along to those lessons, but I didn't learn anything, because what I knew how horrible the life of people was. I understood it. I just had to stand up and say it. I did not need to be trained to make a speech. And that was a little insight into how she understood what leadership was. And it stemmed from that experiential connection rather than from something more distant. We can call that gendered, in fact. But it was an affective mode. It was not it was a mode of connecting with people on the basis of a shared experience, rather than I'm going to come in here and I'm going to tell you why passes are a mode of controlling the economic mobility of women, and right? And that's how she connected, and people respected her for it, and they engaged with her in that way, and they feel a personal connection to her. They feel it, and she worked that personal connection all her life. That was her way of interaction. So the gesture of going to an ordinary person's house because somebody had died was a very effective. People saw her at a time when they did not see the other leaders of the movement, because they were either in exile or they were in the cities, in these highfalutin decision-making spaces, and she was in the townships. So, and there are other examples that I have of that.
If I could just ask one last question. We talked a little bit yesterday about how you were thinking about Winnie and then some of the student protests that have been happening at Wits, and thinking about when the left uses violence. And that's just a very resonant topic, I think, for us here. And I was just wondering if you might want to be able to, just mention a couple of ways in which thinking about Winnie has helped you understand what's been going on at the university.
Yes.
Or vice versa.
Yes. Yeah, well, thinking about Winnie really enabled me to see again, because in a way one knows this living in a violent society, that it is ever present. But you become part of an elite and you sort of forget, because it's no longer ever present in my life, I have to say. But returning to this work reminded me that a lot has not changed in the daily experience of black people. There's still fear. There is still economic exclusion. And that this is not that is experienced in a very direct physical way, about which spaces they can occupy, about how they talk in public and how they present themselves. I think that for a lot of young black men in particular, their public presence in a group is seen to be threatening. For a lot of black women, their life is one of constant fear of sexual violence. So what do we do with that visceral sense of anxiety, if not fear? I think what happened in the student movement is that escalated into the only way in which we can do anything disruptive is if we use violence. And so there were many instances of violence, and that violence invited upon them further violence from the state. And because it seems to me that when you do that on the left, you get involved in a game that you will lose, mostly. You will lose, because the violence that can be deployed against people by the state is so much greater. You will lose. I am wary of taking us there. I'm so, but it did help me to remember why it is there's such a quick resort to an argument for violence, going systematically through one person's life and thinking about that violence in her own life. Why wouldn't she think otherwise, right? And against that experience of violence, asking people to buy into processes of negotiation where you not only have the unequal power of resources, but you also have the unequal power of the access to enforcement of resources. I can see why violence was a tactic. I privately have views about that, but I do understand more, because I think the deep immersion in the life of someone like Winnie produces empathy. And theories don't often give us access into empathy. Do you know? That's it. I have to say there's a degree of empathy that I have that I didn't necessarily have before for her life. I mean, I was an activist in the 1980s, not in Soweto, in Durban, and the issue of violence was debated very extensively. And I think she made a mistake choosing it. And I thought then that she made a mistake choosing it. Now I think she made a mistake, but I understand why the mistake was made. Let me put it in those terms. I would hope that the students would not use violence, only because I think it exposes them to another front of unequal struggle. I don't think it will be productive. And that's different from saying, I don't think violence should ever be used. I mean, that's not what I'm saying at all. But I think you have to be very careful. You have to be very, very, very careful, because if you're not, 34 minors will die. That's a high price to pay for a system that is so resilient. It's not like the 34 miners dying changed anything about the way mining labor continues to exploit those workers. Unfortunately. It's not the same. It's the same here. It's not like, it's this gun control issue, which is so hard for me as an outsider to see, but 17 people being killed doesn't change the structures of power, unfortunately. So why make martyrs when we don't have, Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer. Thank you. Thanks. Right. Thank you all. Staying for so long. Wow.